Welcome to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week, a look at an increasingly popular solution to homelessness. Since its inception about 20 years ago, Housing First has grown in popularity as a way to mitigate chronic homelessness. The program, which stresses getting people off the streets and into low or no barrier housing for free, has reached the Southwest, particularly in Tucson, where its use was a hot topic in the recent city election. When we spoke with candidates, incumbent Democrats like Mayor Regina Romero touted it as a research-backed model that works.
We created a program, Housing First, that is an evidence-based program that we did not have there. And it's a piece of the puzzle. It's not a silver bullet. It is a program that had never been instituted in the history of the city of Tucson.
While challengers such as independent Ed Ackerley and Republican candidate Janet Wittenbreaker both made opposition to the program a part of their campaign.
Tucson has a reputation of giving away free services, free phones, free medical, free food, free homes now, and free. That's a Portland attitude.
There's no expectation that they're sober, that they remain clean. There's no expectation for mental health. The idea is you provide shelter first, and then they'll gravitate towards those things. That has failed.
Use of Housing First programs are likely to continue as incumbent Democrats swept this year's Tucson city elections, holding on to the mayor's office and 3 city council seats. So this week we ask if the opposition to Housing First is merely political, or is it the best way to get people into homes? To start this week's show, I spoke with Steve Berg, Chief Policy Officer at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I started by asking him about the proof that advocates claim to have showing that Housing First works.
In many communities, we have many years of bad housing policy. They left us with really not enough housing for people with the lowest incomes. And this is an attempt to try to get communities to reverse that. It's going to take a while to do that because it took a while to sort of dig ourselves into this hole. And it's going to take a while for us to climb back out. But you can't finish until you start. This is a start for places. I would say I'm hopeful because it seems to be hitting on the right things, trying to get housing available for people more broadly, and then make sure that's coordinated with other kinds of things people need. Those things are hard to get. I was just reading the annual sort of report on addiction in the United States came out and said that only about a quarter of the people who need addiction treatment are getting it. And it's interesting because a quarter of the people who need help with housing are getting that too, by coincidence. But it's very different things. In housing, the money just isn't there. The government has just not put the money on the table.
It seems like in Tucson and a lot of other places, we've had, for lack of a better term, a boom in the unhoused population. And if you ask people what's caused this, we'll hear all kinds of things from rising rent and home prices, mental health, drug abuse. What do you think is the cause for what appears to be an uptick in the unhoused population?
I think this is just part of a long-term trend we're seeing. I mean, to me, it's like homelessness is caused by not enough housing at levels that people with the lowest incomes can afford. Who is homeless? That's more a question of issues like mental health. The reason there's so much homelessness is very much an issue of housing. And this is something it's really been going on since the end of World War II, if not longer than that. But that's how far the data goes back for. And I think to get out of homelessness, they need help with their individual problems. But we also need to solve this housing problem. We went through a period like in the early and mid-teens where the federal government was doing a lot of work to help communities have better homelessness systems, but that only takes you so far. I mean, once the community has gotten a good homeless system in place, now we're seeing, as somebody from Los Angeles was telling me the other day, they moved 6 people from homelessness into housing, and 10 people lose their housing because they can't afford the rent and become homeless again.
We just had a city election here in Tucson, and all of the incumbents sang the praises of the Housing First model. All the challengers said it was a terrible thing. So, for the skeptics out there, tell us about the evidence that Housing First works.
The evidence, it works better than anything else. Let's put it that way. Like the planet for years and years and years, many decades of different kinds of research studies. The latest one is a big one in California that research named Margaret Kushel did, but it just shows the same thing as we've been seeing for years. The housing first approach for a given amount of money, it moves the most people from homelessness into housing. If the amount of money is not enough to move everybody from homelessness into housing, then it's not going to move everybody into homelessness and into housing. It will just house more people than any other kind of approach.
There was a 2020 meta study in the American Journal of Public Health that said there's not a lot of evidence that shows Housing First works when there are issues of substance abuse or psychiatric issues. Are there times where Housing First doesn't work?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by work. If what you're talking about is less homelessness for a given amount of money, Housing First is what will reduce homelessness the most. That doesn't mean it works for everybody. There are some people who it's not going to work for. It just works for more people than anything else anyone has ever tried. That's the best we got. We're always looking for more effective and mainly more cost effective because there's never enough money to help everybody. It is absolutely the case that there are people with housing who have severe addictions, whether they've never been homeless or whether they were homeless and then were back in housing. They just can be dealt with better, more effectively if people have a place to live. Because for people who are living on the street, there's nothing that really works to make addiction better for people while they're living on the street.
Since you've been involved with the homeless issue, and you're with the National Alliance to End Homelessness, for those who are diametrically opposed to the Housing First model, and they come to you and say, no, we're not doing this, but we've got to do something, is there any model you've seen that works comparatively well?
I mean, not really. It's like we're to the point where if people don't want to do Housing First, then I have to question how important the issue of homelessness really is to them. There's plenty of survey research on this. The public regards it as a very important issue, particularly now. The public also understands that it's mainly a housing issue. They see the cost of housing. They think, well, for somebody who's like been living on the streets and has a not very good job history or has a disability that they're trying to deal with, it's got to be even worse. So I think most people around the country really see that housing is the real issue, and we're hoping that that is getting across more and more.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us.
Sure. Glad to do it.
That was Steve Berg, the Chief Policy Officer at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Among the critics of Housing First is Judge Glock, the Director of Research and a Senior Fellow at the conservative-leaning Manhattan Institute. He's written opinion pieces in a number of outlets, including the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. He also served as an expert witness in a lawsuit regarding The Zone, a large unhoused encampment in Phoenix. I started by asking him about our last guest's comment that the biggest issue is a lack of affordable housing.
Affordable housing is certainly a problem for homelessness in general. There is a real tight connection that you see across cities with higher housing costs are going to see more homelessness. That's absolutely true. But if you look at it, the main problems tend to be in the sort of short-term or sheltered homeless population. those populations are the ones that are usually homeless for short periods of time. They usually need a hand up to get on with their lives, often single mothers with children. Housing costs can make a big difference in their lives, reducing those overall housing costs. But Housing First, ironically, is aimed at the chronic homeless population, the populations that are homeless usually for more than a year, that typically has a disability, and it's often out on the streets. And for that population, the housing costs seem to be less important in that they have a lot of problems that, even with very reduced price housing, aren't going to be solved.
So you wrote in a recent Wall Street Journal commentary that Las Vegas may have an answer. They're not doing Housing First. So, first of all, explain to folks what Las Vegas is doing and why you think they may be the example.
Lots of different cities, especially those under the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, are trying kind of new measures to address homelessness. And if I can take a step back, these cities for about the last 5 years have been subject to a ruling called the Martin v. City of Boise ruling that subjects any cities in the Ninth Circuit to basically a ban on street sweeps, removing people from public parks and camps unless they have sufficient shelter. And this led a lot of cities on the West Coast to basically give up on removing people out from the streets, from doing anything, until they built hundreds or thousands of new shelter beds. And there was no likelihood that was going to happen in the near term. So what Las Vegas is doing, to a surprising extent, places like Portland are doing, is finding new lower cost shelter alternatives. Las Vegas looked at this courtyard center they have that it's open air, but it does have a roof and some shelter from the elements. It has fans and water and services and protection. And that both allows them, under this Martin v. City of Boise ruling, to remove people off the streets and the parks, and provides a reasonably low cost alternative to get someone closer to a safe space, a secure place. Portland, again, is doing something similar. The city that once was a byword, and still to some extent is, for the homelessness crisis, said they're going to ban street camping categorically within the next year. And their alternative is setting up these sanctioned camping areas.
When people talk about the homelessness issues, they often point to, as you mentioned earlier, mental health, substance abuse, and they say, though the street, the sidewalk, as you said, is not the place to solve those problems. So if Housing First isn't the answer, how do we solve the mental health, or deal with, maybe not solve, but deal with the mental health issues, the substance abuse issues that many people who are homeless are dealing with?
It is important to note, and some of the more homeless activists are correct to note this, that most of the homeless do not have a substance use or mental health issue. But I think a very important qualification with that fact is they're talking about the overall homeless population, both the sheltered and the unsheltered. And there is a distinct difference between these kind of populations. When you look at the unsheltered population, there you see overwhelming rates of mental illness and substance abuse. This one UCLA study found that about 50% said or drug or alcohol addiction contributed to their loss of housing, and another 50% said mental health issues contributed to their loss of housing. Even more said that either they had significant problems with those two issues. So if you're not addressing those issues, for the unsheltered in particular, you're going to miss a lot of what someone on the street really needs. And some of that means merely getting people to a place where they're going to start to get those services. Getting people off the street into, even if it's something like, one of these courtyards, something that, even if it doesn't completely require sobriety or something, at least has some limits on public drug use and so forth, can be a good step for a lot of people. Another thing that's more long term is we need more mental health beds. We in America have significantly reduced the amount of psychiatric beds, about 90% over the last 70 years, even though our population has grown a lot. For a lot of people facing schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which are the two main severe mental disorders driving people to the streets, they need more than just either a few hours treatment or a prescription that's gonna help them begin to recover. But again, they won't get that on the streets. You're not going to follow a prescription drug regime or get regular treatment if you're off the streets. You might get that in a shelter. A shelter actually has these rules that require people usually to engage with the services and sometimes show some sobriety or show some advancement in their kind of life goals. And that's why that's really necessary for the next step. The alternative, I often say, is looking at something like LA or Phoenix until recently, where you had in LA over 2,000 homeless deaths a year.
You mentioned Phoenix, which has been in the news at least a lot in Arizona with what's known as the zone. You were called as an expert witness in one of the lawsuits over the zone. What did you tell the courts? And the zone is now in the process of being cleaned up, so it's now a past tense. But how do we prevent the zone from moving?
The impact of the lawsuit on the zone is probably more than I or almost anybody else really expected. It looks like as of early November, the zone is effectively cleared. You had an area that had almost 1,000 people in it at one point, and they have almost completely cleared it. There seems to be minimal spillover into other communities, and about 80% of those contacted by the city accepted shelter as an alternative. On pushing it to other communities, there's a great study by Burke and McDonald, came out about 10 years ago, that looked at LA in the early 2000s when they surprisingly had a pretty strong enforcement regime on Skid Row. They really reduced homelessness on Skid Row under LAPD Chief Willie Bratton. And what they showed is that surprisingly, there wasn't a lot of spillover afterwards to other communities. There was a sharp reduction in violence, a sharp reduction in deaths among the homeless. And this didn't seem to impact the wider city. So where do people go? It's kind of hard to know. Some do end up in shelters. Some return to family or friends. Some do return to other communities. But on the whole, it seems that what happens when enforcement is done and done humanely, you do have these wonderful, to my mind, reductions in homeless deaths and violence against the homeless and so forth. And we've seen that several times when cities are willing to carry it out.
I'm sure somebody's going to pick up on something you said, that 80% of the people who were in the zone in Phoenix accepted shelter from the city. And somebody's going to say, aha, housing first. There you go. Counter that argument.
Well, one, I'll admit that I expected the number of people contacted to accept shelter to be lower than that, likely. In most of these cases where you've seen camp cleanups, it has been, kind of at tops more like 50% have accepted shelter as alternative. I think the city did a wonderful job trying to make sure all of these people got into shelter that were willing to accept it. And but I think those who are advocating housing first are distinct from those who are advocating merely a shelter or someplace safe to sleep and so forth. The housing first argument is largely that the only solution has to be these permanent housing units that the person can stay in basically for the rest of their life at little to no cost. And even though those, again, are necessary for some people, for a lot, what they really need is a short-term hand up that's going to get them into a safer space. And that means shelter.
All right. Well, thanks for spending some time with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Judge Glock of the Manhattan Institute. We're looking at the Housing First model of reducing homelessness this week. We conclude this week's show with a report that Pima County commissioned after the first 2 years of its Housing First initiative. Sarah Hunter is director of the Rand Center on Housing and Homelessness, which wrote the report. I started by asking her for a brief summary of it.
Our work was pretty early on in that implementation where I think a lot of the kinks were getting worked out, which is normal, so it did include kind of the ramp up of the program, as well as like early rates of participation. So for Housing First programs, usually the primary outcome is housing stability. And so among this population in Pima County, their rates were very, similar to what we see nationally. So they had 94% retention rates at 6 months and about 82% stability rates at 12 months.
That 80% or 82% number who were enrolled in the county's program after the first year. It's easy to see that in two ways. One, they aren't back on the streets, which is positive, but two, they haven't moved on to what some would call a level of self-sufficiency yet. So what's the best way to look at that number?
Housing First programs weren't designed to transition people to becoming self-sufficient. So now I can say, like, the Pima County's program wasn't directly in line with what Housing First programs were designed to do. So those programs were initially tested and evaluated among populations with chronic health conditions. So people who had co-occurring, oftentimes mental health and substance use problems, and were experiencing chronic homelessness. How Pima County decided to operationalize their program was to target people that were cycling in and out of the criminal justice system. So these folks may, and we didn't get, I think, really complete healthcare data on this group. And also keep in mind, people who are living on the streets tend to not utilize health services in the way folks who are housed. So sometimes they are suffering from these conditions, but you can't really tell that by looking at their healthcare service utilization records. But I can say that this population in general was younger and probably more healthy than a lot of the populations that are typically candidates and enrolled in these types of programs. So you're right that, there is the potential that a lot of these folks could rehabilitate once they're stably housed. But as I say, these programs aren't really designed with that motivation in mind.
One of the things that struck me about your report was, and I guess it was just a lack of knowledge a little bit on my part, how long it took from when someone was accepted into the program to when they actually got into the housing.
So once people are identified as being appropriate for the program, Old Pueblo Community Services did provide interim housing. Average time from referral to intake was 44 days. And then from intake to housing voucher receipt, that was 36 days. That's actually really good compared to national numbers. So Pima County's housing department prioritized these candidates and really put them at the front of the line to get that voucher. And then the time between receiving the voucher and moving in was an additional 51 days.
The report also mentioned that there were savings of about $1.2 million to the county and the state during the time frame you were looking at. That may be a number that surprises people. How does Housing First save the state and county money?
Sure, that's a great question. So how we calculated that value is what we did is we looked at participants' utilization of county and city services for the year prior to being enrolled in the program, and then comparing that to the year after they're placed in housing, and basically adding in the cost of the supportive housing as well. So even taking into account the cost of the housing and supportive services, it's still cheaper to taxpayers to invest in this program than to let people linger on the street. Because what happens is they then cycle in and out of the criminal justice system, which is very expensive, in and out of the emergency room and crisis mental health services, which is very expensive.
So in the recommendations in the report, it says that Pima County should consider reviewing the program to fit some people and noting that a small group accounted for most of the criminal justice and healthcare costs. Are you saying it's important to find the right people and get them into supported housing?
Yeah, I mean, now, as they're implementing it, and as I said, they were implementing it with a population that had more criminal justice involvement than what you typically see for these programs, like historically. It's wise to kind of look at who's succeeding and who's failing in the program so they can tailor it as they move forward to provide, this intervention to the best participant, like someone who's going to succeed. And probably the folks that didn't make it into housing or made it into housing and left fairly quickly need a different intervention.
And finally, the period that you all were looking at was the height of the COVID pandemic, that early 2019 through mid 2021. Did that play at all into the success or not of Pima County's Housing First, or was it just the same thing we were all dealing with?
We didn't find the patterns really changed. It took, as I said, that early period in 2019, everyone was like getting used to how this program was going to work. And over time, they actually got better in terms of moving people through the different phases and getting them into housing. I think there probably was more opportunity overall in terms of dollars being funneled down from the federal government to support people sheltering in place and helping to get people housed. But we didn't see any dramatic shifts due to the pandemic.
All right. Well, thanks for spending some time with us.
Sure. My pleasure.
That was Sarah Hunter of the Rand Center on Housing and Homelessness. And that's the buzz for this week. You can find all our episodes online at azpm.org and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcast. Just search for The Buzz Arizona. We're also on the NPR app. Zach Ziegler is our producer with production help from Desiree Tucker. Our music is by Enter the Haggis. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for listening.
Arizona Public Media's original programming is made possible in part by the Community Service Grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.